Well, happy Tuesday afternoon, everyone. It is great to have you with us for the Hunt Institute's Early Efforts webinar. We're going to give it about a minute for everybody to get logged in. But in the meantime, we invite you to jump into the chat. Let us know who you are and where you're tuning in from today. Gotta be a fast reader to keep up with this chat. Well, welcome once again, everyone. It is great to have you with us. My name is Dan Worry. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which is an education policy resource to the nation's governors and state lawmakers, located in Cary, North Carolina, and created by Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. If you are joining us for the first time, I'll tell you the Hunt Institute helps to support policymakers in education policy issues, really across the full education continuum, from prenatal on up through post-secondary. But once a month on the first Tuesday, we come together for our Early Efforts series, which is focused on the earliest part of that continuum. And we have got a fantastic panel today and a conversation I have to tell you I've been really looking forward to here for months, actually, since we pulled this together. I will tell you that one of the things that we are certainly tracking and talking with policymakers with across the country is an emphasis on third grade reading proficiency, right? That's something that states are really dedicating more and more time and resources to. But one of the things that we have noticed as well is that those efforts tend to be really intensive efforts around the primary grades and don't always take into account the fact that literacy and language develop on a continuum that begins really even prenatally. And so we wanted to have some conversation today around the origins of that third grade reading proficiency and how states and programs and families, frankly, might help to support the early literacy of their children during the years before they go to kindergarten. I think one thing that we've noted to states is, when we're talking about third grade reading, children who are 8 years old have spent 60% of their full lifetime prior to ever setting foot in a kindergarten classroom as 8-year-olds. And so those early years are awfully important, and we've got a fantastic panel to talk about that today. Let me just share a couple of logistical things before we get moving today, beginning with the fact that this, like all of our early efforts programs, is available with closed captioning. And so if that is a service that would be helpful to you, you can find the closed captioning controls down in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Speaking of the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, we are going to spend some time later in the hour going through some questions and using questions that you have maybe for our panel today. Would ask, if you have a specific question that you'd like to pose to the panel, if you would use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and please do not put that into the chat. You can see if you're watching the chat, it moves very quickly, and so if we can separate out questions, that'll help us to make sure that your question doesn't get sort of lost in the ongoing shuffle of the chat. So with that, why don't we jump into our conversation today? Very excited to welcome back Lori Masur, who is Director of Early Learning at Redon, Arizona, and a longtime friend of ours here at the Hunt Institute. Dr. Nell Duke is Executive Director at the Center for Early Learning Success and a professor at the University of Michigan. And Dr. Dana Castro is Director of the Boston University Institute for Early Childhood Wellbeing and a professor at the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. It's fantastic to have all of you with us. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules. And now I want to maybe begin with you. I mentioned your work at Stanford Children, at the University of Michigan, but you are also a co-author of a really important new resource that has been published not terribly long ago by the National Association for the Education of Young Children. It's a wonderful book called Literacy Learning for Infants, Toddlers, and Preschoolers, Key Practices for Educators. And so I thought maybe we would turn to you to help to sort of kick off this conversation and share maybe a little bit about why is this concept of early literacy so critical, and what can we be doing better to support children's literacy development and language development during the earliest years of their lives?
Yeah, great question. And you really laid the foundation for it by talking about the fact that literacy development begins in many respects prenatally. And there's so much that happens in those first years of life that lay a groundwork for later literacy achievement. So reading by third grade isn't something we start at kindergarten. Reading by third grade is something that we start with children when they're very young, in developmentally appropriate ways, of course. One example I like to give is, when we look at an object in our world like a chair, if we turn it upside down, it's still a chair. If we turn it sideways, it's still a chair. And the objects in our world are like that in general. But if you take in English the lowercase letter B, P, Q, and D, that's a completely different letter depending on how you orient it. That's a really odd thing, right, about written language. And children have so many of those kinds of revelations that they can make in those early years of life. We lay a foundation really for children's later literacy development. So there's lots that we can do. I don't have enough time to begin to list all of the things that we talk about in our book, let alone other books we could have written, but a few key things. One is definitely playing with sounds with children, playing with the sounds in words, from babbling early on to singing songs with children, and eventually playing games like having a puppet named Mr. Munch who only munches things that begin with those are just playful ways to hear those sounds in words. Of course, reading aloud to children, so important. And I think everybody on this webinar today probably recognizes the importance of reading to children really from infancy. But there are certain ways of reading to young children that are especially effective at promoting their language and literacy development. So for example, if we read a story to a child and there's a word in there that's new to them, revisiting that word afterwards. So if we just had the word scamper, maybe we practice scampering around the room, just kind of revisiting that language, deepening that language understanding is one powerful way to support development through read aloud. Other important things, having literacy enriched dramatic play, which means in whatever area in the classroom is dramatic play or areas are dramatic play, infusing artifacts for reading and writing into that space. Research suggests that's really helpful to children. So for example, if you've made a bodega planning and play area, you would have like receipts, you might have boxes of food, you might have paper for shopping lists so that children are incorporating that literacy into the play environment. What else? Oh, there's lots of research coming out on how having figurines and replica play toys that follow up on stories you've read to children actually helps to support their development as well. Lots of research on alphabet learning, and just so no one gets worried, we're not talking about drill or worksheets or anything like that. We're talking about the alphabet, going on walks and noticing, oh, there's the letter O for the word open on that storefront, or puzzles, games, that kind of playful way of learning the alphabet. Writing is really important for children. So if in their block area and they don't want anyone to touch what they've built, they could make a little sign, don't touch it. And that will be supportive. And different types of texts we can expose children through, like our program Molly of Denali, which hopefully some of you know about. We're really helping to promote children's understanding of informational texts. I could go on, but I'll stop. It gives you a sense of some of the things we can do to lay that important groundwork for children.
Absolutely, and much more conversation to come. But I really appreciate you also sort of laying the groundwork of I know I have had similar conversations on social media as well recently. I know you tweeted something a couple of days ago about just sort of envisioning a world in which children came to kindergarten even with some of these skills, and the reaction I think in some cases is, oh well, does that mean sort of heavy-handed sort of direct instruction of toddlers, and kind of a knee-jerk reaction that that could be inappropriate. Whereas there are so many ways that that these can be meaningfully incorporated into the lives of very young children in their day-to-day activity in ways that I think a lot of people maybe who haven't been early childhood teachers might be surprised at just how much young children are capable of doing, and through those very literacy rich environments and experiences. So thanks for helping to set the stage with that. And Lori, I wanted to turn to you too. I mentioned, in the opening that lots of states' approaches to literacy have been super focused here in recent years, really in the primary grades, right? That they're talking about, we need, really intensive professional development and literacy coaches, and, a lot of very costly interventions that at some level are designed to sort of catch up children who haven't had the kinds of opportunities that I think Nell was talking about here. But I think important to say that Arizona is not in that camp, and that Read on Arizona is an example of an initiative where the young children and their families and their teachers are being supported in a little different way. Bring us up to speed about Read on Arizona and how it is supporting the youngest children in the state.
Absolutely. So I'll start by just a little bit of level setting around exactly what Read On Arizona is. And first of all, Read On Arizona is celebrating 10 years. It's our 10-year birthday this year at Read On Arizona. And it does serve as the state's early literacy collective impact model initiative with a very strategic focus on school readiness and third grade reading proficiency. And so when we think about school readiness, too much of what Dr. Duke was referring to is what is really happening in that birth to 5 space, and how are we recognizing that when we think about continuity of care and services. It's really about that continuity across the birth through third grade and beyond piece, right? And so to your point earlier, Dan, a lot of attention is paid into the primary grades, but at Read on Arizona, we're looking at the full breadth and scope of that entire continuum as it exists. And so the power of Read on Arizona is actually in the fact that it is a collective impact model of initiative, right? So we have different partners and stakeholders from different sectors, coming together around a common agenda, looking to solve a very specific problem. And in this instance, it's everyone coming together to talk about how are we ensuring that young children birth to 5 in that K-3 space have access to the necessary supports and instruction to be proficient readers. And we want to acknowledge that doesn't include, that does include educators, that does include practitioners, but that also includes families and other caregivers that are interacting with children, and acknowledging that learning opportunities are happening across a variety of contexts and a variety of settings. And so I think that's one of the things that really sets Read on Arizona apart in that space, and the fact that we do have a set of shared priorities and goals and a shared metrics when we think about how are we bringing evidence-based literacy solutions to greater scale? How are we building, capacity as it relates to the science of reading? And how are we also thinking about expanding access to quality early learning? Because we know having access to that quality early learning is going to be that precursor to what happens in that K-3 space, that so much is happening prior to children crossing that kindergarten threshold that's happening in that birth to 5 space. And it's the beauty of Read on Arizona is not just what's happening at that state level, right? But it's also about what's happening within local communities. And so Read on Arizona also has a network of 26 local Read on communities. And part of those Read on communities is having those same shared priorities that I mentioned earlier that are happening at the local level, but local communities and their needs vary, right? So what's happening in maybe the northern part of the state versus the western part of your state, it's going to ebb and flow. And so the beauty of those communities is we have local, governments there. For instance, sometimes it's legislature, sometimes it's mayors. It's our Head Start programs, community-based programs, because we know that when we think about reading or language and literacy, that this is not for one any one entity to solve or to tackle. We have to come together and knit these resources and knit these partners together to begin to address what's happening in the language and literacy space. And so when we think about that work, we can talk about, how Read On has been, a key grant writer and brought in, multiple funds into the community. But the real piece that we like to speak about is how many families have we reached? How many educators, as a byproduct of this collective impact umbrella, have been trained in the science of reading? Over 21,000. How many have, received, a literacy endorsement? Or when we think about some of our campaigns aimed at families, how many families are we engaging and reaching and, increasing their own efficacy when it comes to viewing themselves as teachers of language and literacy to their own children? So I'll pause right there because I know there's plenty more to happen in the conversation.
Absolutely. Lori, thank you. And I want to remind everyone, if you've got questions, we've already got a couple that are popping up in the Q&A. Please feel free to insert them, and we'll come to your questions in just a few minutes. But I want to turn to Dr. Castro. Dana, your work has examined in lots of cases the extent to which early education policies and practices address the needs of bilingual children. And so from your research, talk to us a little bit about what you have found to be the most effective practices to support the language and literacy development of bilingual children.
Of course, Dan, thank you first of all to the Hunt Institute for this invitation and to join the conversation and to think about bilingual children. It was mentioned earlier, that children begin learning language and from birth. And the support to literacy effort begins probably prenatally. And so I will make that connection with and ask everyone to think about what we call the mother tongue, which is the language of the mother before the child is born. And that's the first language that the child listens to and gets connected to. So I think if we begin there, I think we have enough support, and all the research that has been conducted with infants recognizing the language of the mother, but also being connected with that. And this talks about attachment, social emotional development, not only learning. So, and then also research that have demonstrated that infants can recognize more than one language even before they can speak. So we have really all the science that is behind to support bilingualism and multilingualism as an asset for a human being. And also the ability that infants have to learn multiple languages from birth. So that's definitely there. However, it seems like the practices and policies in early childhood care and education are not necessarily supporting or following the science, in the way that it should. So the work that my colleagues and I have been doing for, the last decades have precisely tried to offer this translating this research into practices in the early childhood classroom and how early educators can support these bilingual children by recognizing and acknowledging their bilingualism as part of who these children are, and not seeing bilingualism as a barrier or as unfortunately, I still hear that there is a language barrier when we talked about bilingualism and bilingual development. So we need to start also, changing the language will help us think about bilingual children, as I said, as having these characteristics, and also taking advantage of the multiple languages that different families bring to our communities, and For those who are born into monolingual English-speaking families, the opportunity to learn and add more languages, right? And learn languages as early as possible in their lives. So I think that that's also, we shift or change this paradigm about, bilingualism and multilingualism as assets instead of deficits, right? And so I think that will be beneficial for those who are born in families where, English is not their primary or first language, and for those who are born in monolingual English-speaking families. So I think we all could benefit from that. So I just wanted to mention that to start with. And of course, what it will support is the development and learning of bilingual children is this to give as many rich language opportunities to these children in both of their languages as possible. As I was mentioning, bilingual children will be learning language everywhere, and we have, children learn language everywhere where they are, not just in the early childhood setting or informal, education setting. So taking that into consideration, we have to think that bilingual children will learn vocabulary and different features of language and use and how to use language in both their, English and their family language or first language or community language. You will notice that I am trying to avoid use the term home language. It is a little controversial, I think, for me, because I don't want it, it could be on the one hand, honoring the language of the family, which is important. But the other aspect of this is the message that children may be getting is, this is the language you speak in your home. And not outside of your home, or not when you are with us in the early childhood setting. So that's what is, been thinking about that. I don't have an concrete answer, but I'm trying to at least, if we recognize that children have more than one language and they let them develop and express themselves in their languages, whichever they choose to use in their communication, I think that's the most important. So that they feel that that's who they are, and they have two languages and they can use and change from one to the other whenever they can, and depending on the situation and the speaker they are with, they may speak one language with their peers and then turn to the teacher and speak in the other language. We have, many, their materials, that can show you videos of the beauty of children being able to use their languages freely. And that also shows that, of course, it's going to benefit their cognitive development, the flexibility in their brains, executive function. Well, we can talk about all the important research that has been conducted to demonstrate that bilingualism is, in fact, beneficial for children's development, and not, it will not harm them. It will not prevent them from learning English at all. To the contrary, if they have a strong foundation in their primary language or first language, mother tongue, that will in fact support and help them learn English faster. And if we're talking about very young children, is just to finish here, is that they can learn more than one language simultaneely. So that's the other part. So it's when we talked about very young children, the opportunity to learn languages, from very early in their life is there. So if we support them, they will have that benefit of bilingualism later in their lives, and to support their language and literacy development. I will start here and then I'll stop here, I'm sorry, and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Castro, thank you. And I'll jump into more of the audience questions for the panel here in a couple of minutes. But there's one that jumps out at me already, Nell, and maybe the full panel can weigh in on this as well. Several of us now over the past 25 minutes have made references to the prenatal part of this, that language learning in particular has its roots even before children are born. And I think maybe if you're not well steeped in some of the research on that topic, that may strike some as being a little bit odd. So now, can you maybe start us off with a little bit of what do we know about how language begins even in utero?
Yeah, sure. So the fancy term, or at least one of the fancy terms out there, is prenatal prosodic bootstrapping. So for example, Gervain uses that term, and it basically means that when children are still in utero, they're hearing language around them, and the sound structure of the language, the expression, the sort of ups and downs of our language, which is called prosody, or you might just think of it as expression, that children are actually hearing that in utero. And hearing that in utero primes them, they're a hearing child, primes them after they're born to be paying attention to those same prosodic patterns that they're hearing around them, and therefore tuning in to language more so than they may be tuning into other kinds of sounds. So that's one piece of it that is very clear from research. There's some other things in research that are still somewhat hinted at. For example, there's some qualitative research that when we have families where they read to the child in utero, it can seems to be associated with them having a stronger sense of that child, like as a person who's growing inside them, and that it has some impact on some bonding and attachment and so forth. But that research is, I would say, still in its earlier stages. For sure, we know that there's a language influence of that early experience that children are having with sound around them.
Lori or Gina, anything you want to add on that topic of in utero language learning?
I don't think I have anything to add relative to the actual research that Dr. Duke is referencing, but I think this is where we begin to acknowledge programs like Head Start that have comprehensive services that include, when we think about early Head Start programming, that include pregnant mothers, and the importance of why we support pregnant mothers when they are prenatal supports, when we think about some of those language connections. And I think it's just something as we begin to think about whether it's programming or supports and comprehensive services, maybe taking a page from the early Head Start model and really beginning to think about how we expand services and supports to pregnant mothers for exactly the reasons Dr. Duke was referring to.
It really is fascinating, I will say, and if you haven't had a chance to look into, maybe do a little internet research on prenatal learning, because it is fascinating to see. And I think, Dina, you sort of alluded to this maybe a little bit, but during the final months of gestation, we know that children's hearing becomes operational, maybe a little muffled inside there, but the children are being familiarized, as Nell mentioned, maybe not with the meaning of words at that point, but certainly with the rhythms and the long vowel sounds, for example, of their mother's native language. And there have been fascinating studies that suggest that babies that are just hours old soothe differently and sort of express a preference to their mother's native language, no matter what that native language might be, because of the familiarity. There are other studies that sort of relate that sort of prenatal learning or listening to music, for example, the children whose mother or parents have played "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star," for example, repeatedly during pregnancy, after birth, will soothe differently to that song. Even an interesting study several years ago about children reacting similarly to the TV theme songs of some of their mother's favorite TV shows. And so we know that the origins of language learning are beginning really even before day one, which is fascinating. And Dana, what a gift really to children that are growing up in bilingual households.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I mentioned also on the other side is what happens when there are not childcare or programs or early childhood programs available for infants and toddlers who are coming from bilingual households and their native language. So that really is making us think how you detach that child from that, and the impact that not having access to that native language or mother tongue, as I was referring to, could have in these children's social emotional development and learning. So I think we do not frequently enough think about this when we are proposing or we're thinking about access only in English to early kindergarten education for bilingual children.
Laura, there's a and again, for the whole panel as well, but more, Laura, maybe you could begin on how Arizona is doing this. I mentioned early on that a lot of states are very heavily focused on the primary grades, but training for childcare providers, for example, it tends to be weak in this. And not that there's not training generally for childcare providers, but often that relates to health and safety topics, and isn't. I think I am yet to see at least too many states go real heavily into helping the early childhood educators that are working with very young children understand the important role in language and literacy that they play. Can you talk a little bit about how Arizona helps to support childcare providers on that front?
Absolutely. And so I'll speak to it from sort of a multi-pronged approach. So one of the things that we've done in terms of the state is we do have a campaign known as Smart Talk that is very heavily modeled after the Talk With Me Baby campaign out of Georgia, which focuses on that responsive back and forth conversations using new and different words to help a child become a strong reader. And it's really aimed at caregivers, parents, practitioners, educators for children in the birth to toddler space. And so that has been available here in the state for probably the last 4 or 5 years. Now, with that being said, I'd be remiss to say, do we think we have it at the scale of where we would like to see it in the early learning space? Not yet, but I think that we are getting there. One of our founding partners at the department, at Read On Arizona, is the Department of Ed. And so I want to give a kudos to them because they have really taken a very targeted and strategic approach underneath this umbrella of collective impact model to create and develop trainings in the science of reading that is targeted toward early childhood providers. So for instance, they created one recently on the connection between Scarborough's Rote and our infant and toddler developmental guidelines, having a very keen focus on vocabulary and context building. So they really are building up that menu of supports and services as it relates to effective practices or instructional practices, and things like phonemic awareness, phonics, how are we building vocabulary and context in the space for young children. So that is a pathway that we are working on. There's still work to be done, but I will say that I'm very proud to say that Arizona is taking a very strategic focus into that birth to 5 space when it comes to those strong practices that we want to see when we think about how are we scaling up what we know what works, whether that's for educators or for family members. So it's a work in progress, but I'm glad to see that we're focusing into that birth to 5 with more intentionality, or to the same level of intentionality as we've had that focus in K-3 in the state of Arizona.
I'll get the hang of unmuting sooner or later. No, I was gonna ask you, given the experience of writing this book recently, to this sort of policy level question, what would your guidance be? And everybody, please, let's jump in on this. But what would your guidance be to policymakers who are really interested at this point? They I think earnestly want to see reading in the primary grades happening and in really proficient ways. What would your guidance be as to what should they be investing in or exploring at the policy level for children prior to kindergarten entry?
Sure. Well, predictably, first of all, they should be investing in children's health, because children's health and well-being has an enormous impact on their literacy and language development. So certainly that almost goes without saying. In the realm of early childhood education specifically, investing in high quality early childhood education pays off. We've got lots of studies to show that that's the case. So that means access. And I think policymakers definitely, often are focused on access. How many seats, are we providing free early childhood education to all the families in our state who want or need it? But it's not just access, right? It's also the quality of what's happening in those sites. And we're really seeing from lots of research that access alone doesn't do it. So there are lots of ways to come at, improving quality, and Lori already, brought some of those to the fore. I think for me, one of the big concerns is around equity. So we're seeing too much where the zip code where we're visiting an early childhood education setting is it actually affecting the quality of what's happening in that setting. And that is unacceptable. So something we've been working on in Michigan is having a small set of practices that are so robustly supported in research that we're saying these should be in every care setting. So we have a set of 10 practices that birth to 3, if you're a child care setting, serving children, these are 10 things that need to be happening in your setting every day. And that can't depend on zip code. That has to be for every child. That these supported practices are enacted in culturally and linguistically responsive ways. Similarly, we have a list, we're actually just updating it with some new research, but we have a list of 10 practices that pre-kindergarten classrooms need to be enacting every day based on how strong the research is to support those. So really about saying, just as we have a minimum standard of care in medicine, in this country, if you have diabetes and you walk into a physician's office, no matter where, there are certain things that physician is supposed to do for your care. And if they don't, that's malpractice. Mm-hmm. Well, there are certain things that we need to be doing for our early learners to support their language and literacy development. And if we don't, that's malpractice. Not on the individual teacher, on our whole system that's failing to provide children, every child, with the education that they need. So I'll just pop that in the chat, a website where they can see those lists of essential practices in those years.
Great, because the chat is already asking for them.
And then if I could just follow up, I think I'm sorry, Lori, I didn't mean to. I'm okay.
Nope,
just wanted to follow up and build on what Dr. Duke just mentioned so well and clear. And so if from the perspective of linguistic and cultural diversity, and you were talking about responsiveness, I don't think there is going to be equity or quality, I would say. There is no high quality in a program if the program is not providing linguistically and culturally responsive practices. So all children can benefit from instruction on learning opportunities. And if that means to have access to those learning opportunities, to support them with their 2 languages, I think that's what we need to see happening. And I'm saying this regardless of if there is a policy that supports bilingual education or not. We're thinking about young children, and young children needs the support in their 2 languages. There are strategies that my colleagues and I and others colleagues and scholars have developed to how to support bilingual children in early childhood settings. And then for that reason, I would say that policymakers will need to think about professional development, and also administrators. We need professional development because early childhood educators are not prepared to work with linguistically diverse children. And, so they need to, there is a gap in early educator preparation. And I think this is not something only for those who will get a certificate on or a license on bilingual education or prepare as a bilingual teacher. I think bilingual children are in all of our programs. Every early childhood educators in the United States is going to find a child, most likely to have a child who is coming from a bilingual, multilingual family to their classrooms. And so that's what I say, they need to learn how to support these children. There are strategies, there is pedagogy that is specific to support bilingual children, and then they need that preparation. So it is, and also it's not enough just to hire someone that can speak the language if that person is not prepared to offer high quality early support for language and literacy.
And Dana, there's a question in the chat that I think gets to exactly what you're talking about. She's asking, how can a monolingual English-speaking teacher, which is probably the reality for most classroom teachers in the country, how could they best honor the idea of supporting bilingual children and provide really literacy-rich activities for both languages in the classroom?
Yes, I think, and definitely, I get this question a lot. First of all, it would be ideal that early childhood classrooms have at least one other adult. If it's not the lead teacher, they get the support from, an assistant teacher that can speak the children's primary language. But another, the way is, first of all, to honor the children's home languages is to allow them to talk and use their home language in the classroom. And have materials, books available in the language, show the languages of the children and their labels, and you find, and getting the support of developing this partnership with families is going to be key, especially for those teachers who are monolingual English speakers. They need to rely and collaborate with families to help them, right? And so perhaps families you can send books at home, the book that you are reading in English, send it in their home language for those that are available to home, so that parents can read to their kids the same content, the same stories in their home language and their mother tongue. So and having that, collaboration with parents for those teachers is going to be key, I think. But first of all is to, even if you are not bilingual, you can open that space and the opportunities for children to express themselves and to make them feel that their languages are welcome in the early childhood classroom. I think that's key.
Very important. Gloria, a question for you from Pamela in the chat. You mentioned that Read On Arizona has sort of a collective impact model. What recommendations would you give to others who are watching, who are hoping to engage more kind of state level peers and stakeholders in getting involved in literacy programs for children beginning at birth?
Great question. And I think you start where it makes sense, whether that's at the local level or at the statewide level, right? Where are your partners? Where are there communities and partners who you have this symbiotic relationship with, who you're all committed to, accelerating, language and literacy, like Dr. Duke stated, health providers should be, at the table for the conversation. We know there's such a strong connection with preterm births or dental health when it impacts, attendance coming to program on a regular basis. So I would say where are those individuals within your community? Where are your district leadership? Where are your libraries, at? Where are your community organizations such as your United Ways that are probably there in every state? Get to know who is as part of your legislature. Where is their stance on early literacy or early learning, and begin to invite them to the table to begin to understand where are we at. Dig into your data. I always say Read On always says that data is the engine or behind the work, that we do. It begins, it lights the flame, but the work that you do with your partners is what's fanning that flame, in order for it to grow. So always beginning to start with your data to help determine what's happening in your communities. Where do you possibly have some high needs, but low resources? And how can you begin to work with partners to identify, maybe where some of those investments and resources need to be allocated within those communities? That's an initial place to start. I think it's going to look different depending on your local community, depending on your state. I will say that collective impact work takes time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It could take years to establish. Read On Arizona is 10 years in the making. And that was no small feat on behalf of our state literacy director, Terry Clark, and forming those relationships with state agencies and entities in the philanthropic world, and also with some of our local governments. So it does take time to build but I say lean into your data first to determine what's happening in your community and really begin to think about the resources and investments and strategies that you wish to deploy into those particular areas. And then really begin to think about the shared goals and the shared measure, because the contribution from early care and education is going to look different from school districts, is going to look different from your libraries, it's going to look different from your healthcare providers, but you all have a common interest, which is to ensure that children are reading at grade level. And that starts in the birth to 5 space. You know, if children can't see, things can be very difficult when it comes to following along when mom or auntie or grandma is reading a book and asking you know, questions. If you have a hearing problem, that also can compound those things. So realizing the intersection of those pieces can really help begin to thread the needle on some of those conversations as you think about lifting up collaboration and lifting up collective impact model within your state or community.
That's great. Now, a couple of questions as I'm looking through here, and I'm gonna try to sort of combine a couple of different ideas from questions since we have so many of them. But we were talking, you know, sort of at the beginning of the hour in your first response around the difference between, you know, drilling young children with flashcards, for example, or having them fill out worksheets, and really developmentally appropriate types of language and literacy learning. What would your advice be, both in talking with teachers, you know, that may not fully get that, but also parents who may think, you know, oh well, you know, this is, I really want to ensure that my child is reading, so I'm gonna sit them down with workbooks. I'm gonna, you know, work on flashcards. How do we help to make that transition from practices that we know may not be terribly useful, in fact, may be detrimental with very young children, and guide them into more appropriate forms of literacy instruction?
A great question. If I had the answer, you know, all pat, we would be in a different place. It is very challenging to change hearts and minds around some of these issues. But, you know, the key issue for folks to understand is not only will those developmentally inappropriate practices probably not work based on research, they could in fact do damage. And so we really have to be aware of, is this something that's been tested in research and been shown to be effective for this age group? So let me take a concrete example. So many well-intentioned folks in preschool are trying to teach kids sight words, or, you know, highly frequent words like said or was or the, and get children to memorize those. And I understand how that might seem like it would be helpful to young children. But not only is it not helpful for young children, it's actually harmful, because what it does is sets up the idea that reading is an act of visual memorization. And what we know from research is that's not actually how we learn to read. We learn to read by associating specific letters and groups of letters and specific sounds. So we don't want to memorize the word said as a whole. We want to know that in said, the S represents the sound, the AI represents the F sound, which is a little weird, and the D represents the D sound, right? But that taking apart of the word and mapping our understanding of the word's meaning to the sound structure of the word, to the letters that represent those sounds, that's the secret sauce of learning to read. And so we're actually undermining that secret sauce if we're spending time with preschoolers on memorizing so-called sight words. We also know from research that there's certain developmental milestones children need to hit before that kind of instruction, any kind of instruction on high frequency or sight words, they're miscalled, is actually going to work. So we're causing harm. We're wasting time that could be spent doing things that are appropriate with 4-year-olds, like developing their vocabulary and helping to build their alphabet knowledge. And we could actually be harming them by giving them the wrong idea about what reading is for. So that's just one example of hundreds that I think this panel could give you, where we're doing things with young children in classrooms that aren't helpful and could be harmful. How do we shift that? You know, it's professional learning. It's the policymakers investing not only, as we said before, in access to early childhood education, but in quality, which means having educators who are well paid, who are well supported in their working conditions, and who have the time and space to learn the practices that really support young children's learning. One last thing that I want to say about that question is that I think a lot of why we're getting pushed down and pushed up and all sorts of misaligned practice to age and grade level is because we have such a fragmented curriculum system in this country where, you have one curriculum that the kids might encounter when they're 3, a different one when they're 4, then they get to kindergarten and they encounter 7 or 8 curricula that are none of them aligned with the curriculum that they had the year before and so on. So I'm very fortunate to have some philanthropic funding to develop a free birth through age 8 full day curriculum. So each year is designed for what that year is doing for children developmentally, and each year is designed to build on the next all the way through early elementary. It's not completely ready yet, but you can check out the infant, the toddler, and the kindergarten at greatfirstaid.org. And again, it's a no-cost curriculum, so not trying to sell something, but trying to really make a policy move that I think will help if we can get early childhood curricula to span that birth to 8, to be full day, and to be very carefully aligned with research on what's developmentally appropriate at each age group and what's effective at each age group.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something I want to let everybody weigh in on as appropriate, but we have throughout this conversation sort of lumped language and literacy together. And now you were just talking about the importance of vocabulary. Say a little bit more about how spoken language and the development of vocabulary. And Dina, I want you to weigh in on, how, some children are developing this incredibly rich bilingual vocabulary as well. How does that spoken language help to support subsequent written literacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that sometimes happens, and I think actually is happening quite a bit in the field right now, is people are thinking of language and that as one bucket, and then phonics, spelling, et cetera, is another bucket. It's actually not how our brain works. So our vocabulary knowledge influences our ability to decode and spell words, and our ability to decode and spell words eventually influences our vocabulary knowledge. These are so reciprocally related. So when we are developing that early alphabet knowledge, of teaching the alphabet in preschool, that's going to actually support vocabulary acquisition. And when we are teaching vocabulary in preschool, that's actually going to support reading and writing acquisition. And that's true monolingually. We also know that's true multilingually, that children benefit from that multiplicity of foci on both learning the code, so to speak, of written language, but also developing their oral language competency. I'm sure colleagues have things to add.
I would like to add to that definitely, as Dan, you were mentioning, bilingual children develop their vocabulary in 2 languages. And they, as we were mentioning earlier, they will learn things in different contexts. I remember a colleague of mine, a researcher, asking me for an opinion on how to score the assessment of a child who was initially being identified as not having enough English, sufficient English proficiency to be assessed in English. So they went ahead and began assessing the child in Spanish. But so they selected, identified a Spanish speaking assessor. And the person was conducting the assessment and asking the child questions about, vocabulary, and things, until they got to the point in the question was about naming the colors. And the child began responding in English and giving the name of colors in English. So they came to, the question for me was, how do we score this? This child was supposed to not know enough English, and now he's answering in English. So are we supposed, and I said, well, what are you interested in? Do you want to know if the child has the concept of color? In that case, if that's the purpose, then it doesn't matter in which language the child is naming the colors, right? If you want to know if the child has enough how to name colors in Spanish, in that case, well, he doesn't. He's giving you in English. So and this, just want to mention assessment as one of the challenges that we have in early childhood education as well, because assessments are conducted only in English. So one of our participants, I think I see this comment on the chat from Patricia Perez, and she's talking about how, in the child care center where her child is, they think that her child can say only 3 words, and she knows that the child can say 12 words. So what happens is that you're not paying attention to the whole repertoire of vocabulary the child has. It's just if you are only assessing the child in English. And this leads me also to connect another idea that is related to children with disabilities. And so we need to be thinking about how, it can happen that a child is and we have this with bilingual children. It's either overrepresentation or underrepresentation of linguistically diverse or bilingual children in early childhood intervention, or special education services. Because of this, lack of consideration of the whole repertoire of children, or sometimes because you think that they are not, because they're learning English, they're delayed, or we need to wait. So, and this happens with children with autism who are bilingual, and they are really, in fact, underrepresented in the autism because they are diagnosed later than a monolingual English speaker. Because, educators think that, or the specialist thinks that because of the learning of English, the child is they need to give it time. So definitely this brings me back to 2 things. One is a policy decision is how do we conduct assessments with the bilingual population? And the other one is, again, preparing professionals. If they would have more information about how bilingual children develop, then they will know when a child is truly having a language delay or disability or not.
Fantastic. I know, unfortunately, this happens every time our hour flies by, and we've only got just a couple of minutes left. So let me piggyback on something that Dina just said about the sort of the understanding that preschool teachers need to bring to their roles, and maybe we can extend this to parents as well. And maybe just a quick answer from each of you. What advice would you have, sort of in closing, to parents, to preschool teachers who maybe are watching this conversation today, on are there 1 or 2 things that you would suggest that would be especially valuable in their roles in supporting the language and literacy of young kids? And Lori, maybe we could start with you.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that I would start with is that everyone is a teacher of language, of reading, and of literacy. That's not a role specifically carved out for somebody with a degree or a certificate. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done to raise the efficacy of caregivers and of family members to really honor themselves in that role as teachers of language and literacy. How are you, to Dr. Duke's point earlier, how are we blending and segmenting and playing with language and recognizing that is, the precursor to some of these literacy efforts. We say, at Read On Arizona, when Arizona reads, Arizona thrives, because we realize the connection of having a literate society, not only in terms of academic success, but in terms of civic health and financial prosperity. And so we all have a role to play in supporting the language and literacy development of young children who then grow into adults, so that we are locking in 20, 30 years from now, their civic health and their financial prosperity. So that's probably the main thing that I would emphasize, is we are all teachers of language and literacy. We have a role to play in helping to secure the civic health and financial prosperity of our children today for 15, 10, 20 years from now.
Dr. Castro, what would you add?
I think to the parents, not to be in early educators, I think in everyone, not to think about bilingualism as a barrier anymore. We think to just shift that idea and embrace our multilingualism. We're a country that is rich really in languages and cultures, and that's what what make us the great country. So I think we need to be embracing, and the other idea is equity. Until we do not have equity in early care and education, we cannot talk about quality. So those two concepts are to go together. And families, please talk. Children need a lot of talking, and any language, it doesn't matter, but they need this rich exposure to language, and then, to thrive, so that they don't feel ashamed of who they are, and also they have the opportunity to develop that brain that that they are born with. And anyway, so yes, they have a love of languages and all the cultures that we have in the country. Thank you.
Esther, thank you. Dr. Duke will give you the final word.
There's been a huge explosion of research on how to support development of language and literacy birth to 5. It's not realistic or fair to ask teachers to get through all of that research themselves. Reach out to organizations that you trust that can provide you with high quality information about how to support language and literacy development in these crucial birth to 5 years.
Fantastic. I want to thank our panelists for being with us today, Dr. Dina Castro, Dr. Nell Duke, and Lori Masur. Thank you, all three of you, for taking time out of your busy schedule. And thanks to all of you who tuned in today. I have to say it is an ongoing treat to just sort of watch as the chat rolls by throughout these hours. I don't know if you all caught, you were just invited to New Zealand, all three of you, to go and so exciting to know that these conversations are making an impact not only here in the United States, but all around the world. It's very exciting. So thank you for taking time to be with us. We will be back on the first Tuesday in April. I'm forgetting the date, but first Tuesday in April, 2 p.m., we will be partnering with Trust for Learning on a conversation about nature-based learning in preschool, which is a topic that is getting lots and lots of attention. Really, a topic that has sort of exploded in the context of the pandemic. And now really taking greater root. So we look forward to a great conversation about nature-based learning next month. I hope you can join us for that. And everybody have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join in. And by the way, well, last note, because it has come up in the chat a couple of times, do be reminded, if you want to share this conversation with colleagues, know that the Hunt Institute posts all of these webinars very shortly after we are complete. So probably by tomorrow or the next day on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and just search the Hunt Institute, you'll find not only our early efforts webinars, but all of the other great series that we host. And so if you'd like to revisit this conversation, you'll be able to find it there very shortly. Have a good afternoon, everyone.